It's a forgotten war. Yemen's civil war nears its second anniversary with no end in sight, leaving thousands dead and millions in crisis and a lack of international attention. How can Yemen find its way forward? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The civil war in Syria and the military offensive in Iraq dominate headlines coming out of the Middle East, but in nearby Yemen, the poorest state in the Arab world, it faces its own ongoing conflict and a humanitarian crisis, leaving millions worried about their next meal. CCTV's John Gilmore has this report.
Yemen is caught in a civil war. For nearly 2 years, fighting between Saudi-led coalition forces and Yemen's Houthi rebels, rumored to be backed by Iran's government, has ravaged the country. The war has left thousands dead, tens of thousands injured, and millions at risk. This month, thousands protested against a United Nations peace plan that the country's internationally recognized president has also rejected.
They're collaborators. We say to them, go away, leave our country. We don't want an intermediary. You're not neutral. You're an infiltrator. You sold out and kept quiet about the crimes.
With airstrikes and ground forces fighting for control of the country, the greatest impact of this war has fallen squarely at the feet of Yemen's people. In response to the rebel forces, the Saudi-led coalition has implemented a blockade to limit supplies entering the country. The UN says more than 14 million people are food insecure, and 31% of children have acute malnutrition.
This millet is for harvest, but it's not enough because a rocket landed in that field and burned out all the crop there. There's a big hole there now.
Currently, the UN World Food Programme feeds 3 million people and is now stretching rations to feed 6 million. But aid workers are still struggling to provide necessary supplies.
What we're looking for is an increase in support from the international community to make sure that WFP gets access to the entire country, but also to have the means to reach to those people and to provide them with the food.
A cholera epidemic has hit the country too. The World Health Organization warns that Yemen is facing a critical shortage of medical facilities and doctors, which could have devastating effects on Yemen's people. The UN Special Envoy to Yemen had strong words for the international community during a recent visit to the country.
The situation in Yemen cannot stay like this. People are dying and nobody is asking. The infrastructure is collapsing and nobody is interested. The economy is on the brink of collapse and nobody is proposing reform. I call on all the qualified parties and the international community to open up the trade routes from and to Yemen, and in that way to provide aircraft to transport the wounded.
Here now to discuss the way forward for Yemen, Sama'a Al-Hamdani is a Yemen analyst and runs the blog Yemeniaty. From Jeddah, Khaled Al-Batarfi is a Saudi journalist and professor at Prince Sultan College. And from Tehran, Mohammad Marandi is a professor at the University of Tehran. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Sama'a, let me start with you. We have this war in Yemen, which has been going on for almost 2 years right now. 10,000 people killed, 21 million people, or 80% of the population requiring humanitarian assistance, millions of them facing starvation, famine. Given the magnitude of this tragedy that is unfolding right now, why isn't the world more focused on this conflict?
That's the million-dollar question, I would say. The statistics that you mentioned are quite devastating and quite surprising, I would say. You have a crisis in Syria, a crisis in Libya, a war in Mosul, and then you have the presidential election here in the US. And I think all of that overshadows the attention of the West. In Yemen, it seems very remote, and I think because the Yemenis are isolated, their own government is residing in Riyadh, very few people are speaking for the Yemeni people, and they remain kind of trapped in the country without anywhere to go. The only countries taking them in are Somalia, Djibouti. It's very hard for them to even seek refugee status anywhere else. So I feel like they're trapped and nobody's voicing their concerns out.
What do you know of conditions inside the country right now?
So the conditions would differ based on where you are geographically, right? But what we need to talk about is how the majority of the population, about 90% of them, don't have access to electricity, which is really important. I'm not talking about saving goods in the refrigerator. We're talking about keeping people alive in hospitals, keeping medication in refrigerators. It's really hard. I have family members there who can't have access to their insulin. So imagine people who are not dying from the war directly are dying from lack of medication. People are dying from influenza. Infants are now dying, especially in the Tama region, from famine. So outside of the war, it's quite devastating.
Khaled, Saudi Arabia has been involved in this war. It's been a pretty relentless air campaign by Saudi Arabia. Much of Yemen's infrastructure has been destroyed. It's been assisted by the United States. The Yemen Data Project, which is a group of human rights activists, has recorded 8,500 air raids by Saudi Arabia. And it says more than 3,000 of those air raids hit targets that were non-military, and 2,000 targets were what they say were unknown. Why is Saudi Arabia conducting this war against Yemen?
I believe we have a mandate from the United Nations and from the Security Council to implement Resolution 2216, which is, by the way, under the Chapter 7. It's just similar to the resolution that led to the liberation of Kuwait. We are liberating the country from those rebels who are supported by Iran and are threatening the security of Saudi Arabia, sending Iranian missiles to Mecca and to other cities of Saudi Arabia. This is what we call a fair war, a just war, and it only would stop when the rebels and their masters in Tehran accept the Security Council resolutions.
Dr. Marandi, is this what we are seeing here in Yemen, a war of liberation with the full sanction and backing of the international community via the United Nations?
I think everyone by now knows what's going on in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is carrying out crimes against humanity, and the casualties are much higher than those which have been announced. The siege on the country, where the Saudis, with the help of countries like the United States, have been blocking medicine and food from coming into the country, has created casualties that are not even being counted. The deaths are at least in the tens of thousands. The Saudis, of course, they have been bombing funerals, they've been bombing weddings, they've been bombing schools and hospitals, and they have no shame whatsoever. They failed in trying to occupy the country. They've been attacking the capital, thousands of airstrikes on the capital, Sana'a, over the last year, over a year and a half now, and they've been unable to take the city, and that's basically because the population is completely against them. What the Saudis want to do is install a regime that had no legitimacy. They installed a Mansour Hadi, who was the only candidate in an election. He was supposed to be a transitional president for 2 years. He stayed on for more than 2 years, and he had no legitimacy. And when he resigned and fled the capital and fled the country and went to Saudi Arabia, and then this illegitimate president authorized the Saudis to destroy the country. And that's basically what the Saudis have been doing up to now. But the Saudis have already lost the war. And this is of course, a great tragedy, but that Yemen has been so destructive. But the Saudis have lost the war.
Okay, Khaled, I'll give you a chance to respond to that in a moment. But Sama, let me ask you, do Yemenis see this as a war of liberation?
It depends on where you are geographically. You have the people in the south of Yemen that have been calling for secession for many, many years, and they are under the assumption that this war will give them the southern country that they've always wanted. What's happening now in Yemen is very similar to what's happening in Libya, in that we have two separate cities that are competing to be the capital, and you have the government reassigning everything from the capital Sana'a to the capital of Aden, trying to reinstate itself there, but failing to do so so far. And then on top of that, you have a situation with Saudi Arabia and Yemen that is similar to the US and Iraq, meaning when they went into Yemen, they thought that this would be a short war that they will easily win. But what's happening now is splintering groups on the ground, and the war seems to be continuing. It's been 19 months. And so far, it's not clear whether the government would be able to return at all.
If it is seen by a war of liberation by certain groups in Yemen, how does one explain the fact that so many civilians have been killed? You know, as Dr. Marandi just pointed out, there was a bomb attack, cluster bombs were used on a funeral, 140 people killed, 500 people injured.
It's because the bombing is targeting only specific portions of the country. Those are the northern portions of the country where the people are not resisting the Houthi militia. A lot of them are civilians who do not wish to take up arms and engage in the fight. A lot of the bombs are targeting sites in cities where civilians reside. So while the war was called just war, it's actually been targeting civilians and not military sites or Houthi sites. They don't distinguish between civilians and militia members, and that's when you see the high casualty numbers. There is an oversight over who's being targeted, and nobody's taken accountable into the crimes that are being committed, and that's why the US is suddenly more engaged. Ever since this funeral bombing that we just mentioned, the US has been trying to end the war in Yemen. Secretary Kerry is, in fact, right now in Oman trying to push a peace settlement amongst everybody. The last peace settlement was actually suggested by the UN. All parties agreed to it except for the government. But they are now, as of today, reconsidering that deal.
Okay. Khaled, what do you make of the fact that, as Dr. Marandi told us, the president left, he was illegitimate, he went to Saudi Arabia and then gave the Saudis permission to destroy his country?
Now, in Yemen, the fact is there is rebels who were revolting against a legitimate government that's recognized by the whole world, except for Iran and the United Nations and the Security Council resolution. They produced 8 Security Council resolutions in this regard, and it's very clear. And everything the alliance is doing is according to those resolutions, going by the book. And what we are doing and asking for is to implement those resolutions. And the problem is, whenever those people, the rebels, come to the table and decide to accept, they get calls from Tehran and they change their mind the next day. Tehran has an interest in continuing this war. And it doesn't matter if all the Arabs are killed as long as no Farsis are involved.
Okay, Dr. Marandi?
Well, I think that it's very disturbing for anyone to speak like that. It's quite clear what sort of atrocities are being committed in Yemen. And it's clear that the Saudi regime is basically, because of the money that it has been spending, as the UN Secretary General has admitted, they've forced the UN to back off. The UN blacklisted the Saudi regime for its barbaric acts in Yemen, and within 4 days they took the Saudis off the list. And we know that the United States, the British, Western countries put the Saudi regime on the UN Human Rights Council, this regime that in Syria, as he made a quick reference to, it is that regime, the Saudi regime, along with the Qataris, which supported extremist groups. We now know from Clinton's emails, thanks to WikiLeaks, that the Saudis knew all along that they were funding that the Americans knew all along that the Saudis were funding ISIL and up to 2014. The email was in 2014. We know that the Saudis are funding Al-Qaeda. And in Yemen, the Saudis have been working with Al-Qaeda groups in different parts of the country. This is all known. So what the Saudis are doing is they're spreading extremism across the board. They're committing crimes against humanity in Yemen. And through bribes and threats, they force the UN, as the UN Secretary General admitted, to stay silent. It's clear as day.
Sama'a, from what we're hearing here, in some quarters, this conflict is being portrayed or characterized as a proxy war, as a war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Do you believe that to be the case?
I mean, we just witnessed that to be the case between our guests. There is a lot of animosity. They are engaging in combat with each other in different parts of the Middle East. And so Yemen seems to be an extension of that. But I would say that a lot of the involvement in Yemen has to be given to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. It's, of course, known that the Houthis have some sort of relationship with Iran. However, they're not taking orders from Iran. That's been stated over and over again. And so far, Yemen is lucky to not have active Iranian presence on the ground, or kind of, the proxy war has not actually translated to be completely a proxy war. It is described as one. It could potentially be one. But right now, it is a country that is witnessing civil war. We have to be clear about that. The Yemeni people are fighting amongst themselves. They don't really agree with each other. And then on top of that, you have the Saudi-led coalition, which is composed of several Arab states launching bombs in. What these bombs are doing is they're just exacerbating the humanitarian crisis that we're seeing. It's not really solving the civil war. The minute you stop the air campaign, you're still going to have Yemenis fighting each other on the ground, which means that the peace solution is going to require to go a step further and include local actors in order to achieve peace in Yemen.